Something happened before recorded history that was so catastrophic, so total in its destruction, that entire populations vanished underground. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but physically. They built cities beneath the earth. They carried their food, their rituals, their children, and their dead into tunnels that stretched for miles, and they stayed there. For how long? The tablets do not say. What waited above, however, they described in language that has no modern equivalent, language that does not translate cleanly into any scientific category we currently recognize. This is not mythology dressed up as fact. This is fact that was recorded in a mythological framework because the people doing the recording had no other language for what they witnessed. The distinction matters enormously. The tablet in question is not a single artifact. It is a composite record drawn from multiple clay fragments recovered across Mesopotamia, fragments that were dismissed for decades as ritual poetry or priestly exaggeration. Only when researchers began cross-referencing the Sumerian king list against subterranean architectural findings across Iraq, Turkey, and Iran did the picture begin to shift. What the tablets describe and what archaeology is slowly confirming are not two separate stories. They are the same story told from opposite ends, and the number 90,000 is not an approximation. It appears in the original Sumerian with a precision that unsettled even the scholars who first translated it. Not a round figure offered as an estimate, a specific count, the kind of number that comes from a census, not from a legend. To understand why that number matters, you have to understand what Sumer believed about the surface of the earth during this period, and why the surface was something to be survived, not inhabited. The Sumerian cosmological texts operate from a premise that modern readers consistently misread as poetic license. They describe a sky that was not the sky we know, not a vault of blue with weather moving through it, but a sky that had become something else, something that pressed downward, that changed the quality of light reaching the ground, that altered the behavior of water, of soil, of animals, of the human body itself. There was a convergence from above, not rain, not fire in the conventional sense, but a sustained interference with the upper atmosphere that produced effects on the ground that were unlike anything the Sumerian population had encountered within living memory or within the living memory of anyone they could consult. The effects on agriculture were immediate. The effects on water sources followed within what appears to be months. The effects on human health came last, and they were the ones that finally drove the decision. 90,000 people do not decide to move underground on the basis of bad weather. 90,000 people move underground when staying above becomes a condition they have calculated they cannot survive. The tablets describe the process of descent with a bureaucratic precision that is, in its own way, more disturbing than any supernatural language could be. There were administrators. There were records of who went in carrying what, responsible for which portion of the underground system. There were agreements, formal, witnessed, written down, about how long the underground period was expected to last and what the conditions for return would be. There were disputes, recorded in the same matter-of-fact legal language the Sumerians used for property disputes and grain transactions, about the allocation of underground space. This was not a panicked flight. This was a managed operation. The difference between those two things is the difference between a refugee column and a military withdrawal. One is chaos responding to catastrophe. The other is an institution executing a plan. That level of organization implies something else. Warning. Whoever made the decision to go underground did not make it in the middle of the catastrophe. They made it before, which means they had information. Which means there was a source of that information, something or someone that understood what was coming well enough to give the population time to prepare. Preparation at this scale does not happen in days. The tunneling, the supply stockpiling, the administrative structuring of who goes where and carries what, this takes years, which means the warning itself came years in advance. The tablets are not ambiguous about what that source was. They describe beings who arrive before the closing, the same beings who appear across the entire arc of Sumerian mythology, under various names, but with consistent characteristics. Height beyond the human range, a relationship to the sky that was not worship, but familiarity, knowledge of cycles that operated on timescales no human civilization had yet measured, and a specific instruction, repeated across multiple tablet sequences in language that is remarkably consistent. Go below. Store what you need. Wait for the sign. What is the sign? The tablets give two descriptions that appear to correspond to the same event seen from different angles. The first describes a change in the quality of light, not the return of normal sunlight, but a different quality of illumination that would precede it, something the Sumerians described as the light that arrives before the light. The The second description is geological, a sound from the deep earth that would travel upward through the tunnels before the surface became safe to return to. Both descriptions share something important. They are not passive observations, they are instructions for measurement. They tell the underground population what to monitor and what the specific threshold for return looks like. Neither of these is impossible. Neither of these requires supernatural interpretation. What they require is a framework in which someone understood what was going to happen well enough to tell people exactly what to watch for on the other end of it. That level of predictive precision, calibrated well enough to give a measurable exit condition for an event that had not yet happened, is not the product of intuition. It is the product of either prior experience with the same cycle or a model sophisticated enough to project its behavior forward in time. Inside the underground system, the tablets describe a civilization that did not stop functioning. They continued to govern. They continued to record transactions. They continued to observe ritual cycles, which in Sumerian practice were not merely religious, but were also practical calendars, tracking time, tracking celestial movements through whatever shafts or instruments they had constructed to maintain that observation even from below the surface. The scribes kept writing. The administrators kept their ledgers. The astronomers kept their observations current. This last detail is one of the most striking. The underground settlements described in the tablets were not sealed boxes. They had systems for tracking the sky. This means that even underground, cut off from the surface they had fled, the population that descended maintained the tools of astronomical observation. They were waiting for something specific, not for the catastrophe to end in a general sense, for a specific measurable event that would tell them the catastrophe was over. That specificity suggests knowledge, not hope, not intuition. Knowledge of a cycle that had a predictable endpoint, and the instrumentation to identify when that endpoint arrived. A population that is merely hiding does not build astronomical instruments. A population that is executing a plan does. The architectural evidence, while fragmentary, is consistent with this picture in ways that archaeology has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The Derinkuyu underground city in modern Turkey, which could house tens of thousands of people and includes ventilation shafts, water channels, and separate quarters for animals and humans, is the most famous of the surviving examples. But the dating of its deepest chambers remains contested. The structural logic of the deeper levels, the placement of the shafts, the orientation of certain chambers relative to celestial positions, suggests a design intent that goes beyond simple refuge. It suggests permanence. It suggests that whoever built it expected to need it for a duration that the surface populations of historic Mesopotamia did not typically plan for. The Sumerian tablets do not describe Derinkuyu by name, but they describe a category of structure that Derinkuyu fits precisely. They describe what translates as houses beneath the house of the earth, engineered spaces, not caves, built by people who understood load-bearing, ventilation, water management, and the psychological requirements of populations that would be living without natural light for extended periods. The engineering implied is not primitive. The ventilation shafts alone, the calculations required to keep breathable air moving through tunnels, housing tens of thousands of people and their animals, represent a level of fluid dynamics knowledge that mainstream history assigns to periods well after the dates the tablets suggest. Extended periods. This phrase, buried in the administrative records of the tablets, is the one that researchers consistently avoid pressing on too hard. Because if you press on it, if you ask what extended means in the context of a managed underground habitation for 90,000 people, the answer that falls out is not weeks. It is not months. The food storage records, the generational language used to describe leadership transitions within the underground period, the references to children who were born below and had not yet seen the surface, all of these point to a duration measured not in a single season but in multiple human generations. The people who descended were not the people who returned. The return was made by people who had only heard the surface described, who had grown up in tunnel light. They described something more unsettling, entities that were indifferent, that moved through the changed surface environment as if it were their natural condition, that the Sumerians, watching through observation shafts, could see but could not interact with, could not communicate with, could not predict. Indifference, in this context, is more frightening than aggression. Aggression implies you are visible to the threat. Indifference implies you are simply irrelevant to it. Whether those descriptions correspond to something physical, atmospheric phenomena misread as living entities, megafauna displaced from their normal ranges by whatever catastrophe had altered the surface, biological processes made visible by changed atmospheric conditions, or whether they describe something else entirely, is a question the tablets cannot answer, because the population that recorded them did not survive long enough above ground to investigate. What they saw through the shafts, they wrote down. What it was, they did not know, and they were careful enough or frightened enough not to go up and find out. What they knew was that it was up there, and they were down here, and the boundary between those two conditions was one they maintained with extraordinary discipline until the sign came. When the sign came, the tablets described the return with the same careful administrative language as the descent, an ordered emergence, assigned zones. Scouts sent first, then reports relayed back down, then a staged repopulation of the surface that moved in waves rather than in a single mass exodus. The Sumerians did not simply pour out of the ground when it was over. They returned to the surface the way they had left it, deliberately, systematically, with records being kept at every stage. The scouts who went first were not volunteers. They were a specific category of personnel described in the tablets with a term that translates roughly as those who go ahead to confirm, a designated role with designated responsibilities in a process that had clearly been planned in advance. And then they built the civilization that history knows them for. The cities, the writing, the mathematics, the legal codes, the astronomical tables, the agricultural systems, all of it emerged in the aftermath of an underground period that the Sumerian records treat not as a catastrophe they barely survived, but as a managed transition between two states of the world. The language they use for the emergence is not the language of survivors. It is the language of people following a schedule. That is the detail that the mainstream historical account cannot absorb without fundamentally changing its model of how civilization developed. Because if the Sumerians emerged from underground with their administrative systems intact, with their astronomical knowledge intact, with their legal frameworks intact, with their agricultural expertise intact, then those systems did not develop on the surface in the slow incremental way that the standard model requires. They developed below it, in the dark, during a period of surface catastrophe that no current model of ancient history adequately accounts for. The implication is not minor. It is not a footnote requiring adjustment. It is a structural challenge to the entire timeline of human civilizational development. The 90,000 are not a footnote. They are the link between whatever came before and whatever came after, between the world the tablets describe as existing before the closing and the world that Sumer built in the opening that followed. They carried something into the ground with them, not just food and tools and administrative records. They carried knowledge that could not have been assembled underground because there was no time for it to develop there. Knowledge that came from somewhere else, from someone else, and was preserved through the underground period the way seeds are preserved through winter. Not to be used during the cold, but to be planted when the thaw makes planting possible again. What came before? Who built the systems that allowed 90,000 people to descend in organized fashion? Who understood the cycle well enough to predict its endpoint and provide the instruments to measure it? Is the question the tablets raise without answering. Not because they don't have an opinion about it, but because the answer they give is one that every framework we use to evaluate ancient history is designed to reject before the evidence can be weighed. The tablets name the architects of the descent. They describe them consistently across multiple sources, with a specificity that is incompatible with myth-making, in the way anthropologists typically understand myth-making. Myths explain what people don't understand by populating it with relatable agents, gods who feel, who compete, who make mistakes, who have favorites and enemies and personal histories. What the tablets describe is different. These are agents described not as feeling, but as knowing, not as competing, but as calculating, not as making mistakes, but as operating on information sets that the human population around them could observe the results of but not access the source of. The human Sumerians could see that what these beings predicted came true. They could not see how the predictions were generated. You can call that a god if the framework you're working from requires it. You can call it an advanced civilization if your framework permits that. You can call it a misunderstanding of natural phenomena if your framework demands it. What you cannot do, what the tablets do not permit, is call it simple. 90,000 people went underground because something changed above. They had help from something that knew the change was coming. They survived. They emerged. They built Sumer. And the civilization they built carried inside it the fingerprints of whatever was done for them in the darkness before they arrived. Organizational structures too sophisticated for a newly emerging people. Astronomical knowledge too precise for a civilization without centuries of uninterrupted sky watching. Legal frameworks too complete for a society that had just learned to write. Sumer did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a continuation. Scholars have noted this for a century without being able to explain it. The answer may be that it was a continuation of something that went underground when the closing came, that survived in the tunnels, and that emerged when the sign arrived, carrying everything forward into the world that waited above. And somewhere in the administrative records of a descent that lasted generations, in the fragments of clay that are still being dug out of Mesopotamian soil a century after the first excavations began, there are details that have not yet been translated. Sequences that scholars have categorized as too damaged, too incomplete, too strange in their vocabulary to render with confidence. Passages that describe the closing in terms specific enough to identify if only someone were willing to cross-reference them against the right geological record. Descriptions of what waited above that are detailed enough, specific enough in their behavioral observations, to suggest that whoever wrote them was not simply afraid of the dark. Those fragments are still there, in storage, in academic archives, in the space between what the tablets say and what we have decided, so far, we are willing to hear. The clay survived. The writing survived. The question is whether the institutions built to interpret them are capable of surviving what the interpretation requires,